At 8:15 a.m. on August the 6th, 1945, a single bomb detonated 577 meters above the center of Hiroshima and killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000, as people who had survived the initial blast died from burns, from blast injuries, and from a condition that the doctors treating them did not yet have a name for, because the condition had never existed before. The bomb was called Little Boy. It had taken 3 years and $2 billion to build. It weighed 4,000 kilograms. It destroyed 16 square kilometers of a city in approximately 1 second, and generated a fireball with a surface temperature of several thousand degrees, hotter than the surface of the sun, at its core. The city of Hiroshima had a population of approximately 350,000 people on the morning of August the 6th. It had been deliberately preserved from conventional bombing raids in the preceding months, so that the damage assessment of the new weapon would be uncontaminated by prior destruction. The people of Hiroshima were, without knowing it, the control group. This is a video about what the 24 hours after 8:15 a.m. on August the 6th actually looked like from inside the city. Not the history of the Manhattan Project, not the strategic debate about whether the bomb should have been dropped, not the subsequent decades of nuclear proliferation, but the specific experience of being in Hiroshima on that day, what the survivors saw and did not see, what the city looked like in the hours after the blast, why people who walked away from the hypocenter died weeks later from causes their doctors could not explain, and what it meant to be in a city where the infrastructure for responding to a catastrophe had been destroyed by the catastrophe itself. You are in Hiroshima. It is a warm August morning. The air raid sirens sounded earlier and then went silent because the radar showed only a small number of aircraft, not enough to constitute a bombing raid by the standards of 1945. You have gone back to what you were doing. It is 8:14 a.m. First, you need to understand what Hiroshima was on the morning of August the 6th, 1945, because the city that existed before 8:15 a.m. was a functioning Japanese city of the second tier, not Tokyo, not Osaka, but a significant regional center with a population that had fluctuated during the war years as military personnel moved in and civilians moved out. Hiroshima was the headquarters of the Second Army, the military command responsible for the defense of southern Japan against the Allied invasion that Japanese military planners were preparing for and that American military planners were preparing to execute. It had military installations, military personnel, and military significance. It also had, on the morning of August the 6th, approximately 280,000 civilians, men, women, and children, who lived and worked in the city and who constituted the overwhelming majority of the people present when the bomb detonated. The city had been spared conventional bombing raids throughout the summer of 1945, while other Japanese cities burned. Tokyo had been firebombed in March, killing an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all had been subjected to the systematic incendiary campaign that General Curtis LeMay's 21st Bomber Command was conducting against Japanese urban centers. Hiroshima had not. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, confirmed that Hiroshima had been deliberately withheld from the conventional bombing campaign so that it could serve as a target for the atomic bomb under conditions that would allow an accurate assessment of the weapon's effects. The people living in Hiroshima in the summer of 1945 had noticed that their city was being spared and had interpreted this in various ways. Some assumed it was because of the American prisoners of war held there, some assumed geography, some simply accepted the relative safety without explanation. None of them knew the correct reason. The morning of August the 6th began with an air raid alert at 7:09 a.m., triggered by the weather observation aircraft that preceded the Enola Gay, the B-29 Superfortress carrying Little Boy, by approximately an hour. The all-clear sounded at 7:31 a.m. when the radar showed only 3 aircraft, well below the threshold that Japanese air defense doctrine treated as a bombing formation. People who had taken shelter returned to the streets. Workers who had stopped on their way to work continued. students who had been mobilized for the city's war production. Hiroshima, like all Japanese cities in 1945, had deployed middle school students as a labor force in the factories and on the streets, returned to their assigned positions. The city was, at 8:14 a.m., going about the business of a wartime morning with a population that had learned to treat small formations of American aircraft as reconnaissance rather than attack. The Enola Gay released Little Boy at 8:15 and 2 seconds a.m. from an altitude of approximately 9,470 meters. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonating at its preset altitude of 577 meters above the Shima Hospital, approximately 800 meters from the Ioi Bridge that had been designated as the aiming point. The 43 seconds between release and detonation are the last 43 seconds of the world as everyone in Hiroshima knew it, and for the people directly below the hypocenter, they were the last 43 seconds of their lives, though they did not know that and had no way to know it. The aircraft was too high to see clearly. The bomb was invisible. The only warning available was the sound of the aircraft, which arrived before the aircraft itself, and which gave no information that distinguished this moment from any of the other moments in the preceding months when American aircraft had passed over Hiroshima and continued on. The detonation produced, in the first millisecond, a fireball approximately 280 meters in diameter with an internal temperature estimated at several million degrees Celsius. The thermal pulse, the wave of radiant heat that moved outward from the fireball at the speed of light, reached the ground in the area below the hypocenter before the blast wave arrived, because light travels faster than pressure. People and objects in the open, within approximately 1 kilometer of the hypocenter, were exposed to thermal radiation intense enough to cause instantaneous third-degree burns over their entire exposed body surface. The flash lasted approximately 3 seconds. Within that 3 seconds, the surface temperature of exposed skin within the kill zone reached levels sufficient to carbonize it. The blast wave followed the thermal pulse by a fraction of a second and moved outward from the hypocenter at approximately 1 kilometer per second, demolishing wooden structures, which constituted the majority of Hiroshima's buildings, within a radius of approximately 2 kilometers and causing structural damage to reinforced concrete buildings at significantly greater distances. The combination of the thermal pulse igniting structures throughout the city and the blast wave demolishing them created the conditions for the firestorm that followed, a self-sustaining fire that consumed the rubble of the destroyed buildings and generated its own wind system, drawing air inward from the surrounding area and producing fire conditions that lasted for several hours after the initial blast. Michihiko Yamaoka was 14 years old and working on building demolition detail approximately 1.8 kilometers from the hypocenter when the bomb detonated. She described seeing a bluish-white flash, and then nothing, a gap in her consciousness, and then finding herself on the ground, unable to understand what had happened or where she was. She could not see clearly. She could feel that her skin was wrong, but could not yet process what wrong meant in the context of what she was experiencing. She walked, or moved in the direction she believed was away from the center of the city, for a period of time she could not subsequently estimate, and eventually reached the river that ran through Hiroshima, and stopped there because other people were stopping there. The river, she said, was full of people. Some of them were in the water, some of them were on the bank, some of them were not moving. She could not, at that point, determine which category she herself belonged to. The rivers of Hiroshima. The city was built on a delta with 7 river channels running through it, became, in the hours after the blast, the primary gathering point for survivors from the central areas of the city, for reasons that were simultaneously practical and instinctive. The rivers were open space in a city where the buildings had collapsed and were burning. They were water, and the burns that survivors were experiencing created an overwhelming sensation of heat and thirst that drew people toward water regardless of whether the water could help them. And the rivers were visible landmarks in a city where every other landmark had been destroyed or altered beyond recognition, making them navigational reference points in a landscape that had, in the space of 1 second, become entirely unfamiliar. Takashi Nagai, a physician and radiologist at Nagasaki Medical University, who survived the Nagasaki bombing 3 days later, and whose writings on both events have been widely read in Japan, described the condition of the survivors moving through the streets in the hours after the blast as unlike anything in his medical training or experience. He wrote that the most immediate visible characteristic of the survivors from the areas closest to the hypocenter was the condition of their skin, hanging from their arms and faces in gray sheets, detached from the underlying tissue, carried by people who were still walking because the nerve damage was sufficient to delay the onset of pain. The Japanese word used by survivors in their testimonies for this condition, and it appears in enough independent accounts that historians treat it as a consistent observation rather than a literary trope, is somehow both clinical and insufficient for what it describes. Doctor. Michihiko Hachiya, the director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, was at home approximately 1.5 kilometers from the hypocenter when the bomb detonated. His diary, published in English as Hiroshima Diary, is one of the most detailed medical accounts of the immediate aftermath. He described waking on the ground with injuries he could not initially account for, walking toward his hospital through streets where the damage was so complete that he could not orient himself by any familiar reference point, and arriving at the hospital to find it partially destroyed and filled with patients arriving faster than any medical response could address. He wrote that the most disturbing feature of the first hours was not the scale of the injuries, which was beyond any framework he had for processing scale, but the silence. The people coming in were not screaming. They were moving quietly, many of them, in a state that he described as beyond pain, beyond shock, in a condition for which his medical vocabulary had no precise term. Now we need to talk about what happened to the people who survived the blast and the firestorm and the immediate physical destruction, because a significant portion of the Hiroshima death toll did not die on August the 6th. They died in the days and weeks and months that followed, from a condition that the Japanese physicians treating them in the summer of 1945 did not understand and could not treat because it had never existed in a clinical context before. The condition is now called acute radiation syndrome, and it is the result of exposure to the ionizing radiation produced by the nuclear detonation, gamma rays and neutrons that pass through the bodies of everyone within a certain radius of the hypocenter and damaged or destroyed the cellular machinery responsible for producing blood cells, repairing tissue, and maintaining the immune system. The presentation of acute radiation syndrome in the Hiroshima survivors followed a pattern that, once it was understood retrospectively, was consistent enough to be clinically described, but that in the summer of 1945 was experienced by both patients and physicians as a mysterious and terrifying secondary catastrophe arriving after the first one. Survivors who had walked away from the blast apparently uninjured, no burns, no visible wounds, began presenting with symptoms in the days following: nausea, vomiting, fever, hair loss, bleeding from the gums and under the skin. The blood counts of those who received them showed catastrophic decreases in white blood cells and platelets. The immune systems of people who appeared to have survived the bomb were failing, and the physicians treating them had neither the diagnostic framework to understand why, nor the therapeutic resources to address it, even if they had understood. Setsuko Thurlow was 13 years old and working as a student mobilized for military communications duty approximately 1.8 kilometers from the hypocenter. She survived the blast, the collapse of the building she was in, the fire, and the radiation exposure that followed. She has spent the subsequent 8 decades as one of the most prominent hibakusha, atomic bomb survivor, advocates for nuclear disarmament, and her testimony before the United Nations and at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in 2017, when the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons received the prize, is among the most widely documented survivor accounts. She described the first hours after the blast as moving through a city that had become unrecognizable in every dimension: physical, sensory, human, and the days that followed as watching people around her die from causes that nobody could explain, in a city where the medical infrastructure had been destroyed along with everything else, and where the people responsible for providing care were themselves dying of the same unexplained condition. The response of the Japanese government to what had happened in Hiroshima in the first hours and days after the blast was shaped by 2 factors that operated simultaneously and in tension with each other. The first was genuine uncertainty about what had happened. The The communications infrastructure of Hiroshima had been destroyed along with the city, and the reports reaching Tokyo in the first hours were fragmentary, contradictory, and impossible to verify. The second was the political and military context of August 1945, in which Japan was losing a war that its government had not yet publicly acknowledged losing, and in which the admission that a single American bomb had destroyed an entire city carried implications for the continuation of the war that the Japanese leadership was not immediately prepared to process in public. The official Japanese government announcement about Hiroshima, released on August the 7th, the day after the bombing, described the city as having suffered considerable damage from an attack by a small number of B-29s using a new type of bomb. It did not use the word atomic. It did not describe the scale of the destruction. American President Harry Truman's announcement of the bombing, released on August the 6th while the Enola Gay was still returning to its base on Tinian Island, used the phrase atomic bomb and described Hiroshima as an important Japanese army base, a characterization that significantly understated the civilian character of the city and that the United States Strategic Bombing Survey would later assess more precisely. The gap between what had happened in Hiroshima and what the governments of both countries told their populations had happened in Hiroshima is one of the defining features of the event's immediate aftermath, and it shaped the experience of the survivors in ways that extended far beyond the physical injuries. The American occupation of Japan, which began formally with the Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945, imposed press censorship on reporting about the atomic bombings that lasted until 1952. Japanese journalists, physicians, and scientists were prohibited from publishing research or reporting on the medical effects of the atomic bombs, the experiences of survivors, or the longer-term health consequences of radiation exposure. The Allied occupation authorities established the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission to study the health effects of the bombings on survivors, a research program that collected extensive medical data from hibakusha over several decades. The commission studied the survivors. It did not treat them. The distinction, which was noted by survivors and their advocates at the time and has been documented extensively by historians since, reflected the research priorities of an organization whose primary mandate was data collection for military and scientific purposes rather than medical care for the people whose health data it was collecting. The hibakusha, the Japanese term for atomic bomb survivors, literally meaning explosion-affected people, faced discrimination in Japanese society in the years and decades following the war that compounded the physical consequences of their exposure. Fear of radiation, combined with incomplete and frequently inaccurate public understanding of what radiation exposure meant for health and heredity, led to discrimination in employment and marriage. Hibakusha were in many cases reluctant to identify themselves as survivors because identification carried social costs. The Japanese government did not begin providing medical support to hibakusha until the Atomic Bomb Survivors Medical Care Law was passed in 1957, 12 years after the bombing. Full compensation legislation was not enacted until 1980, 35 years after the event. The last surviving hibakusha are now in their 80s and 90s. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum estimates that as of 2023, approximately 113,000 registered hibakusha remain alive. The numbers that frame the entire event are numbers that have been revised repeatedly as historical research has improved and as the records of both the Japanese government and the American military have become more accessible. The immediate death toll, people killed by the blast, the thermal pulse, and the firestorm on August the 6th, is now estimated at between 70,000 and 80,000. The total death toll by the end of 1945, incorporating deaths from acute radiation syndrome and from injuries sustained in the blast, is estimated at between 90,000 and 166,000. The range reflects the genuine uncertainty in the historical record. Census data from the period is incomplete, many victims left no documentation of their existence, and the boundary between deaths attributable to the atomic bomb and deaths attributable to the general conditions of Japan in the final months of the war is not always possible to draw precisely. The moral debate about whether the bombing of Hiroshima was justified, whether the deaths of between 90,000 and 166,000 people in Hiroshima and the comparable deaths in Nagasaki 3 days later were a proportionate price for ending a war that might otherwise have cost more lives in an Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, is a debate that has been conducted continuously since August of 1945 and has not been resolved. The argument that the bombs saved more lives than they took by ending the war before an invasion was the official American justification at the time and remains the position of a significant portion of historians and strategic analysts. The argument that the bombing constituted a war crime, regardless of its strategic effects, that Japan was already seeking a negotiated surrender, and that the primary purpose of the bombing was as much a message to the Soviet Union as it was a military action against Japan. These arguments are also represented in the historical literature with serious scholarly support. Both sets of arguments have been made by serious people with access to the same evidence and have reached different conclusions, and the person who tells you the debate is settled is telling you something about their politics rather than the historical record. Setsuko Thurlow, speaking at the Nobel ceremony in Oslo in 2017, said that the hibakusha had for decades been described as victims, but that they had never accepted that description as complete, because victim implied passivity, and what the hibakusha had done for 70 years was the opposite of passive. She said that every time a person heard the word Hiroshima, they should hear the word never again, not as a slogan, but as a specific commitment to a specific action, and that the specific action was the elimination of the weapons that had created the category of experience she was describing. She was 85 years old when she said this. She had been 13 on August the 6th, 1945, and she had been carrying what she saw that morning for 72 years, and she was still carrying it, and the weight of it, she said, did not decrease with time. It changed shape, but it did not get lighter. You are in Hiroshima, and it is 8:14 a.m., and the all clear has sounded, and you have gone back to what you were doing, which is what everyone around you has also done, because the radar showed only 3 aircraft, and 3 aircraft is not a raid by the standards of a war that has been burning Japanese cities for months. You do not know that the 3 aircraft include one carrying a bomb that will detonate in 60 seconds above the hospital 800 meters from where you are standing. You do not know that the reason your city has been spared the conventional bombing that has destroyed every other major Japanese city this summer is that it has been preserved specifically for this moment. You do not know the word hibakusha yet, because the word does not exist yet. In 60 seconds, it will begin to exist, and you will spend the rest of your life learning what it means to be one, and the rest of your life will be shaped in every particular by what happens in the next 60 seconds, and there is nothing in your experience of the world as it currently exists that tells you any of this is coming. The morning is warm. The city is going to work. It is 8:14 a.m.